everyone, and a very, very warm welcome to all of you. Well, as you know, the theme of this event is networking and leadership, with the aim to transform the future by enabling leaders of tomorrow. We have planned multiple power-packed sessions, thought-provoking discussions, and we have a great mix of policymakers, industry experts, entrepreneurs, and visionaries. And the idea is to discuss very important aspects that can actually contribute to nation building. So on that note, as we celebrate the 125th year of the Scindia School, Fort Gwalior, we'll welcome you to the 4th edition of the much-awaited FGPS Symposium. Late FGPS, as you all might know, was better known as Mahatma. He was also the founder of the Indian public school movement in the country. He was a renowned educationist, and he also gave form to the dreams of late His Highness Madhav Scindia by converting the Scindia School, which was earlier a school for the princes, to the first Indian public school, the first of its kind in the whole country. He also had the vision of being a renowned educationist, and today this session is an ode to the founders of the Scindia School, Fort Gwalior. Today the focus, as you know, is on international relations, defense, and diplomacy. So, well, before I set the ball rolling there, I would like to just point out to all of you something that I think we are all very proud of, about how India has emerged as a global power in the past few years. Morgan Stanley, one of the most influential companies of the world, has said last year that 3 mega trends are positioning India as a global superpower. And namely, they are global offshoring, digitalization, and energy transition. The World Bank also agrees with Morgan Stanley's vision. In recent years, multiple reports have forced and forecast India as becoming an emerging world power across sectors. So clearly, the way is very promising, and India needs to be on a strong growth trajectory. But are we making the right moves? Are we in the right direction? We will find out all that and more from our esteemed panel of experts. And on that note, I'd like to invite Sindhian Vikram Mishri, a 1989 batch Sindhian and IFS officer, to give us the welcome address. So please give him a big round of applause, Mr. Vikram Mishri.
Thank you. Good morning. I would like to thank SOBA and especially the Delhi chapter for inviting me to be here as part of this symposium. Not just for inviting me here and giving me this opportunity to rub shoulders with eminent citizens from yesteryears, but also to, in fact, be part of this panel of very distinguished experts in their respective fields in defense and diplomacy. None more so than Ambassador Shivshankar Menon. I must say, one of the reasons that I look a little nervous this morning is that this is an unusual position for me to be in, to be introducing a panel on which Ambassador Shivshankar Menon is going to be speaking, because some of you might know, he was my direct boss in at least 3 assignments that I have held in over 34 years of my career. So the normal position is across the table. He's on one side and I'm on the other side, but climbing a stage before him is a little bit of an unusual position for me. But I will not stand very long between you and the experts who are going to speak on this panel. I did want to say that when we speak of defense, diplomacy, and security, any nation's national priorities consist largely of 2 broad baskets. One is ensuring security against internal threats and security against external threats. The other is ensuring development, and development in all of its constructs. Economic development, economic security, technological development and security, energy security, food, agriculture security, and now increasingly climate security, because that's becoming a major existential issue. But both of these broad baskets of policy have a very important third enabler, and that enabler is partnerships, and largely international partnerships. And the better your international partnerships, the better your international footprint, the more options you have. The more options you have in terms of policy, the more options you have in terms of your national development. And that is where the key task of diplomats and diplomacy comes in. Diplomats work, and our diplomacy works to broaden as much as possible our policy options so that we are not locked into one position, we are not coerced, we are not blackmailed. And I use these words advisedly because these are increasingly becoming the currency of international politics and diplomacy. In an interdependent world, we will need and continue to need partnerships globally. And that's where the task of diplomacy becomes very, very important. And I would say that multiple generations of Indian diplomats have contributed to that task and continue to contribute to that task. The topic of this panel would have been relevant at any point in the several last decades in history. But it's perhaps particularly relevant today because of the changes that are going on all around us, and I'm sure you'll hear about more of these from the panel. I find it a little bit ironical that when I joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1989, it was a tumultuous time in international politics. The Cold War was ending. German reunification was upon us. The Soviet Union was collapsing. And we entered what many have called the unipolar moment, with the United States reigning supreme in global politics and global economy. An age of globalization dawned on the whole world. This began to change not long after, especially 9/11, and then even more strongly after the global financial crisis. What is, and why I said ironical is that as I approach the end of my career, we seem to be ending, or I seem to be ending, on a similar note of global crisis, whereas you had this impulse of globalization dawn 35 years ago, we see today globalization under enormous stress. Multilateralism, which was a building block of international affairs, also under enormous stress. And the supply chains that held global economy together under even more stress. And all of these are reflected in the great power competition that is once again upon us. 35 years ago, it would have seemed anachronistic to talk about continuing great power competition, but we are again in that age. So today we have two broad forces coalescing: the stress on globalization on the one hand, the return of overt great power competition on the other hand. And these are the troubled sort of oceans that Indian diplomacy and Indian security policy makers have to cross in the coming years. And I think you have seen a little bit of this in a microcosm over the last 12 months on account of the crises that have erupted in Europe. These have erupted as security crises in one part of the world, but they have very quickly morphed into economic and really existential crises for many countries all across the world. Indian diplomacy has charted a very careful and calibrated course through these challenges, and I have no doubt that we will continue to maintain a moderate course, keeping in mind at the end of the day our supreme national interests. And that is what security policy making and diplomacy is all about, to guard your supreme national interests. I will not speak more about these. I think I'll get out of your way and let the experts take over. But once again, thank you very much for inviting me here this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That was a very insightful address, and it's a privilege to have you here with us today. Moving on, before I begin the show, I would like to also acknowledge Mr. Shambhir Hussain, who has put together this entire panel with his relentless efforts. This is his brainchild, the FGPS Symposium. So please give Mr. Shambhir Hussain a big round of applause. Well, for a nation that's following a path to a larger power status, problems relating to foreign policy, as mentioned by Mr. Vikram Mishri, are of utmost importance. That country needs to focus on internal and external relations going forward, and needs to also strengthen and protect its borders. So to understand what is the vision for India for the next decade, we'd like to call our esteemed panelists. So we'll begin with the short keynote address with each speaker, and then we would have a free-flowing discussion, after which we'll also open it for you all to have a direct Q&A with our guests. So we're looking forward to a very insightful discussion with our panelists. I'd like to begin by calling Sindhin Shiv Shankar Menon, sir. He is also a former National Security Advisor and diplomat and author, and we all are well aware of his various accomplishments. So please give him a big round of applause. So please come. We'd also like to invite Major Maroof Raza. He's a well-known speaker, media commentator on global military and security, and he's also a well-known author. Up next is Commodore Uday Bhaskar. He's another very well-known speaker on defense, security, strategic affairs, and global maritime security. And I'd also like to invite a very popular international TEDx speaker, actor, and TV defense analyst, and my co-anchor and moderator, Major Muhammad Ali Shah. Please welcome him on stage. So please be seated. So thank you all for joining us today. And just to set the context here, as I mentioned before, the US Commerce Department has designated India as an emerging market way back in the year 1995. With each and every passing year, India has been gaining in stature, and all the other economies are taking notice. So as India is poised 76 years after gaining its independence, what is the vision that it needs to follow? How can it really achieve its vision as an emerging power? What are the things to keep in mind? So I would like to first request Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon to open and address the audience with a 2-minute keynote speech. Thank you, sir.
Hey, that's unfair. 2 minutes to Shankar Menon.
Why not? She's obviously heard me before. So, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's nice to be, well, almost back in school. I was a bit worried when I came in, quite frankly, because everybody was younger than I was. And most people had joined school long after I left, until Mr. Gandhi came. And he left school in '59, the year I joined. So, but he also had the good sense to go to the right house, to Jayaji House. My God, 57, see? No, and it was so nice to be reminded of school by that. That poem was fantastic. So I can't resist telling you a story. Forget about the world. You know, in '64, in our final year, Mughal-e-Azam came out. So 3 of us bunked school and went to see Mughal-e-Azam and came back to school. We were heroes, you know. I mean, everybody knew. We were so proud of ourselves. We had managed to get all the way to Lashkar, come back, until 2 days later in assembly, Shukla, principal, looks straight at the 3 of us, smiles at us, and says, I have good news for the school. We're all going to see Mughal-e-Azam in town day after tomorrow. And he looked straight at us and smiled at us. Puss, we went. But it was a lesson in leadership, right? Because it taught us with grace. If he could have yelled at us, he could have punished us, and we'd have resisted. I mean, we wouldn't have learned a thing. But that's what the school meant to me. It was a place where every day you made friends, you did all the things that you mentioned. I remember crying almost going up that ghat too. But it really was a remarkable school. But anyway, school might have been wonderful, but I'm afraid the world is not so good today. Vikram told us rightly that this is a world of great power rivalry. I think some parts of the world forgot during that unipolar moment, during globalization decades, that great power rivalry is really intrinsic to any state system. You go all the way back to Kautilya, you know. Why does Kautilya make sense? Because what he talked about then is still happening today. People are still doing the same thing. We are now in a world where the balance of power is shifting, where globalization is under threat, as Vikram reminded us, even though that can only go so far, where there is tension in all the hotspots ringing China, from the East China Sea, Taiwan, South China Sea, our border with China, all the way across, and where, frankly, the international system the multilateral system has broken down. Look at the reaction to the pandemic. Pathetic. What did the world do? It was really each one for themselves. We had to take care of ourselves. So this is a world, I would say, between orders. We had a bipolar Cold War world. We had a unipolar moment when the US was the only dominant superpower. And today we are between orders. We're not quite sure where we are going. There are some of us who like to say this is a multipolar world. I think it flatters us to think that we are a present or future pole, and many people say this. But it's not really a multipolar world. It is multipolar in one respect, economically. There are 3 economic superpowers today in the world, the US, EU, and China. But militarily, there's only one power which can project military power where it wants across the world when it wants, and that's the US of A. So the world is unipolar militarily, multipolar economically, and politically you know how confused it is. I mean, it's complete confusion. So this is a world between orders. We're in transition. And the result is much higher geopolitical risk for all of us. I don't have to list all the things that, and we're not quite sure where we're going. The Chinese will tell you it's a bipolar world. Again, I mean, that's self-serving because it elevates them to the US level. If it were a bipolar world, but it isn't, quite frankly. Look at Ukraine. What does Ukraine prove? It's a European problem of European order. But it also shows how ineffective the rest of the world is, but how we are all affected by it. Because it's a globalized world, whether it's food prices, whether it's energy costs going up, whether it's the inflation across the world, all this affects all of us. But who is capable of actually changing the situation in the Ukraine now that it's being dealt with militarily? Very few. Those who are in the continent and the US. That's it. I mean, China, frankly, looks quite ineffective when you look at Ukraine as a political or military force. Economically, yes, she matters. So we are in this strange betwixt and between sort of world. But what does that mean for us? It's interesting. It heightens our challenges, and we have, I think, I would say, 2 big challenges. But it also gives us a whole set of opportunities, because it's a world in transition, right? We are not happy with the old world. We want something better for ourselves. We want to make something of ourselves. Our job, India's foreign security policy, is to transform India into a secure, prosperous, modern country where every Indian can realize their full potential. That's our job. And a world in transition actually gives us many more opportunities. So in a sense, I have good news and bad news. The bad news is the world's in terrible shape. The good news is that that doesn't mean that we are in terrible shape. It actually means that we have opportunities. The challenges are clear. Because the world is in transition, China is making her bid to be the dominant power, and we happen to be in her way, in her judgment. And the primary driver of geopolitics now is Sino-US rivalry, not just in Asia, but across the world. And the US, which has, since World War II, prevented the emergence of a peer competitor. She saw off the Soviet Union, saw off Germany, Japan, now China. Whether she'll be successful or not, we don't know. But US will do whatever she can to prevent another superpower emerging. And China knows this. And therefore, that's the core rivalry, with Russia as a junior partner now increasingly for China. But what does that mean? It means that for us, India, in the Cold War, South Asia was a backwater. The main focus of rivalry was in Europe. Today, we are beside the main focus of rivalry, which is maritime Asia. It's in the Indian Ocean, it's in the South China Sea, this is where their contention is playing out. So suddenly, South Asia is important. Both sides need you or consider you, they look at you very differently from the way they looked at you before. The US uses persuasion, friendship, the tools of diplomacy. China uses coercion to try and impress you with her power and to get you to do what they want. But whatever it is, it might be unwelcome forms of attention, but the fact is that you are now central to one of the biggest geopolitical rivalry in the world. This gives you balancing opportunities. Suddenly, the US is willing to do things with you that she wasn't willing to do 10 years ago, 20 years ago. You suddenly find you have other friends in the neighborhood. I mean, we owe China many of our friends, actually. But because they are equally the rise of China with the shift in the balance that represents. So you actually have several sorts of opportunity. It also means that you have to up your game. In South Asia, you have a huge opportunity. In the last year in South Asia, year and a half, 5 governments have changed, not all of them happily or willingly. 3 of them are in talks with the IMF because they face debt crises and they want to head that off. And yet the world has done nothing. Look at Sri Lanka, defaulted in April last year, and everybody's seen this coming, but the world hasn't been able to do anything. The West will not put money in, even through the IMF, because they say, why should we pay their debts to China? China won't put money into Sri Lanka, because if she puts money in Sri Lanka, the other $1 trillion on the BRI that she's given, every one of those fellows will come with his hand out, saying, what about us? So you're at an impasse. We try in the G20 saying, no, everybody has to take a haircut. But each one is saying, pehle aap. And nobody is solving the problem. I mean, we are the only ones who've really helped Sri Lanka. But here's your opportunity to do something in South Asia, to make the rupee the means of payment in South Asia. Because you now have the largest economy and the capacity to actually carry these economies. Why did Sri Lanka survive 26 years of civil war with 1 year of negative growth? Nepal survived 12 years of civil war with, again, 1 year of negative growth, because they were open to the Indian economy. And now is your chance to actually consolidate your periphery, because you need a peaceful periphery if you want to transform India. You can't have them falling apart and India doing well. It won't work. So you have an opportunity in the neighborhood, you have an opportunity with the US, and you see that in the transformation of the relationship over the last few years. And it's not only China. Frankly, for India, the US is more important, because I can't see us transforming India if we have bad relations with both China and the US. And if we don't have access to the kinds of markets, technologies, etc., that the US still controls. So for me, that's another opportunity. The third, of course, is the Global South. And you would have heard a lot, because you saw in Ukraine, most people didn't want to choose sides in the Ukraine between the West and Russia. Most of the world, including Brazil, Mexico, countries who otherwise are intrinsically Western, they wanted to find there is no third way. And today, in this confused situation that I described, of a world between orders, they're looking for somebody else that they can work with. And that's where India stands to gain. I mean, I'm not saying that the old-fashioned non-alignment is coming back. But what you do offer is an alternate, honest way of looking at things and dealing with things. And there are over 55 developing countries who today run the risk of debt traps or debt crises or default according to the IMF. And this has been building for 4 years. That's 55 countries. And there's no solution in sight. Now, you can't solve their problems economically, but they are looking for alternate ways of dealing with the world. And that's where I think India has an advantage. Because we have a proven record. If you look at it in the last 75 years, by every metric of power, India has done better than every other country on earth except China. China has done even better in the accumulation of material power. There are three things that successful rising powers have done in history. Three sort of features that are common to them for the successful ones. One is, of course, they accumulate material power, military, economic, hard power. That, as I said, we've been relatively successful at. The second is they actually follow accommodative policies with the existing world order, so that the world order, the existing order, doesn't see them as a threat and enables their rise. That's what China did until the world economic crisis of 2008. I mean, after all, China wouldn't have risen if the West hadn't opened their markets, if they hadn't transferred technology, if the US and the others hadn't made it possible. So most successful rising powers follow an accommodative policy with the existing order until the moment has come when they're strong enough to actually change the order in their likeness or in their suit their preference. But that timing is important. To do it right, do it later. Third thing they all have, and that's something that frankly, again, India has done reasonably well. But the third thing that's common to successful rising powers in history is having a narrative which not only explains the rise to their own people, but also explains it to the rest of the world. And that's where I think we need to do some work. Because in the last few years, I think we have managed to confuse ourselves about what we stand for in the world. If our single criterion is the betterment of the Indian people, as I said, the transformation of India, then actually most foreign policy and security calculations become very simple. You have a hierarchy of what's important, what is not important, and you can decide what to do. If you look for status, for glory, for revenge, then you start confusing yourself. You should be looking at outcomes which help you to transform India. If that's your goal, then you do one set of things. But if you add other goals, that I want recognition, I want to be a leader, I want to be this, I want to be that, then you confuse yourself. You also confuse the world. And when you start proclaiming that I'm a leader, when you reveal ambition, it's very difficult to withdraw it. And even if you then back down, and this is China's problem, Xi Jinping's problem today, he has revealed his ambition to be center stage in the world. So everybody is reacting and pushing back, including Japan, Vietnam, Australia, India, all his neighbors, except Russia. And so you need that narrative, and that's something that we still need to work on. But basically, I'm an optimist. As I see it, we're heading in the right direction. And India, has a way, I think, of surprising people, and I'm sure we will do so again, but on the upside. I'll stop there. Rather like this India school, actually. Thank you. Thank you very much.
As always.
Thank you, sir. That was a very interesting and motivating keynote address. I'd like to now request Commodore Uday Bhaskar to give us a keynote. You can do it here as well. We can start as you prefer.
When you're nervous, it's better to stand. Good morning, everyone, and greetings. I want to thank SOBA, the Old Boys Association, Mr. Sen, for giving me this opportunity, and also to greet all of you on the 125th. I am unable to pronounce the word, so I shall call it the Q Centennial. Mr. Deepak very kindly gave me the right word, but I know I'll trip up, so I'm not going to say it. It's the Q Centennial. Greetings to all of you, and may you sort of glide into the next 125 with the same kind of elan. I have a very difficult situation. I share Vikram Mishri's, Mr. Mishri's quandary that following Mr. Shankar Menon is a very imposing task. Effortlessly he sort of mapped out what I would call as the big picture. And I'm altering some of the points I wanted to make so that I can carry forward the broad kind of theme and make it relevant for SOBA. If you come here this morning on a Sunday, I'd like to presume that there must be some takeaways for you as a collective, whichever generation. Mr. Gandhi I've just met. 1959 you said, sir, and there's 1957, so it's a very distinguished group of old boys. My own brief is to look at Indian security in its most holistic manner and perhaps dwell on both the challenges and the opportunities. And I'd like to pick up the opening remarks made by our anchor, as also by Mr. Menon and Mr. Mishri, to say that India today is in a very distinctive position for a variety of reasons. And amongst all the attributes, my own formulation, today talking about India is like the blind man and the elephant. You can pick up any one part and be convinced that your interpretation or your formulation is the most appropriate. So my own focus over the last few years is to talk about India's relevance index. That India today has a relevance which is acknowledged, for a variety of reasons. And I think those have been touched upon by Mr. Menon also. And within that, the one vertical, Vikram, Mr. Mishri spoke about those two baskets. One is the development and the other is the challenges and the compulsions of security. If you look at India's own security at this point, challenges in its holistic manner, which is both the external and the internal, as also India's capacity to deal with these challenges and opportunities, I tried to sort of come up with one word that would perhaps be most appropriate. And I hope I can take this liberty and say that while India has enormous potential and pedigree from 1947, the first war for Kashmir, to where we are now, I would characterize the current situation for India as parlous. Parlous as in P-A-R-L-O-U-S, which most of you know what it means. अगर हम हिंदी में कहें तो कह सकते हैं कि इस वक्त जो स्थिति है भारत के लिए, अगर हम संपूर्ण सुरक्षा की बात करें तो एक प्रकार से नाजुक है. दूसरा, जैसे शंकर मेनन साहब ने बताया है, एक कोहरा है, एक असमंजस है. There is a transition. Maybe transmutation might be a better word in terms of, as he said, we are between orders. Whether what will crystallize will be an order or not, to my mind, is also part of the fog, part of the asmanjas. And in that context, if we were to look at the uncertainty, danger, these are some of the descriptions or the meanings of the word parlous. My own assessment of India's capacity to deal with both the opportunities and the challenges, again, it's my view, is inadequate. And today, of course, there is a lot of what I would call as aspiration in India to be a major power, to be a leading power. There are all kinds of formulations. I have personally, in public, when I've written about this or spoken, my own advocacy, and my conviction, by the way, is that India should be a responsible power. A responsible power unto itself, to its own citizens. And again, Mr. Menon has already, I think, formulated this very, very appropriately, that the ultimate responsibility of governance is the development of the citizen. Of late I've been having problems with the Indian semantic, the Indian discourse. There's a lot of talk about India being ruled. And in the 75th year of independence, I find that a bit jarring. We are being governed. We are not being ruled. And that is where SOBA, I think, can play a very important role in irrigating the discourse. You ask India, you are pedigree, you are Gwalior, you are in the fort. But yet, in 47, we decided that we would govern ourselves. And in that context, I think the ultimate responsibility for governance, again, we go back to the Arthashastra, Mr. Menon made reference to that. The ultimate responsibility of the, we often slip into the word ruler, so do I. Chanakya spoke of the Chakravartin. He spoke about dharma, Rajadharma. And it ultimately boils down to Yogakshema, the welfare and the well-being of the citizen. So using that as the template for India and those who are now governing it, I make the observation that today the number of challenges that India has to address externally are complex. They are also intractable. Some of them in the short term. And in keeping with the paradox of the times, many of these external determinants are influencing the internal security fabric. This, alas, in my view, has been compounded by the overlap between the perceived external security challenge and its leavening or its permeating into Indian politics, domestic politics. Now, I don't have to elaborate as to what exactly I'm drawing attention to, but we have seen this trend where the external has got leavened, as I said, with the internal security, and that can become very difficult to manage and handle. I'll give you 3 brief examples when I illustrate as to how this has happened. Circling back to Babri Masjid, 1992, Mumbai 1993, Parliament attack 2001, the Mumbai attack again in 2008, and the kind of challenges that our own security establishment has had to deal with, very often effectively but quietly, is representative of what I would call as the internal dimension. And if this is not handled in a prudent and judicious manner, I fear that many of the aspirations, many of the potentialities that are beckoning would not be realized. And India would be in this very difficult situation of seeing potential receding while the pitfalls come closer and closer. And that is why our focus on capacity. I'm a security analyst. I've often been accused of being a jaundiced security analyst and that I'm always drawing attention to the bleaker part. But I think if you go to a pathologist, that is the duty, the responsibility of the pathologist to give you an accurate summary of whatever be the findings. And my own concern, and I'm closing on this, is that today, if you look at the transitions that are taking place, that on one hand, India is in dire need of a security kind of reform, which perhaps could be compared to what Prime Minister Narasimha Rao embarked upon as far as the economic liberalization and reforms of India were concerned. That was done by stealth. He was very, I think, fortunate in having a team led by Dr. Manmohan Singh and all the other professionals at that time. There was bench strength. I fear that today, in the transition that India is embarking upon, our bench strength is inadequate. Our commitment is also a bit flaky. My example constantly is that in Modi 1.0, we had 4 defense ministers. You can't really expect to bring about the kind of transformations with that kind of political, what I would call as prioritization. And most recently now in Modi 2.0, we have embarked upon 3 very important transitions. One is higher defense management. You're aware that we constituted or we created the post of the Chief of Defense Staff. That has become a bit tragic because of the manner in which we lost General Rawat. But subsequently, the gap that took place, pulling a retired officer out, making him CDS, all this, I say as a Fauji, as a security analyst, is not the best kind of, shall we say, higher defense management rearrangement. At the bottom end, all of you know Agniveer, the new scheme. We are completely rewiring the recruitment pattern for the Indian military. The army in particular will be the most affected. Now, I'm only saying this as an observer. I'm a naval guy. I don't know the army too well, except as someone who admires the institution. I think there are challenges. The drivers for this, I think, perhaps, are not necessarily contributing to capacity in its most holistic manner. This is my personal view. It's also a minority view. And the third adjunct of capacity, if you look at the allocation of resources, I'm afraid it is not adequate. While there is constant refrain saying that if the need comes, we shall not be found wanting. I mean, that is a reactive approach to defense, which we have seen for decades. So as a result, I stick my head out. I say it's powerless, but I hope that we can redress it. And that's where I hope SOBA can make a difference, because look at the pedigree of SOBA. You have Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon, former National Security Advisor. He is a global voice today. You have Mr. Vikram Mishri, who's still in the loop. He's the Deputy NSA. And I'm sure there are many others here who, in their own way, contribute to. I don't recognize all of you. But I think SOBA can consider irrigating, as I said, as citizens of India. You don't have to be specialists. Just to say that let's do a reality check. On that note, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I'd like to now invite Major Maroof Raza for a quick keynote before we begin our discussion for today. Please give him a big round of applause. Major Maroof Raza, a well-known commentator.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. You know, I find it much easier to appear on television shows because I convince myself nobody's watching me. I can say what I want. But Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon, sir, whom I hold in very high regard, Commodore Uday Bhaskar, sir, again, you are a leading light in the field that people like me also tread along in. Major Ali Shah, I've known the family for years. His distinguished father was again a role model in the army. And so many friends here. Deepak, who roped me in for this event. My only visit to Scindia School was to play football there, 1975. And I'm embarrassed to say we lost to Scindia School. Though I'm from the other boarding school, Mayo College. And though we had won the Mayo football tournament, we beat many a scenic school there and military school there. But the fault was mine, because of which we lost. I was the school back. And I shouldered one of their forwards so hard that he was carried off in a stretcher and the school got a penalty. So that's the only goal that was scored against us. But we made up for it by beating Delhi College. So much so for those memories. This is a very vast subject, and it requires each of the points that one would like to talk about requires many a minute. I'll try and keep it to short 5-7 minutes, because then Major Ali can get his act together. But broadly speaking, today the world is in a situation where I think nobody quite anticipated that it will be in about 3 years ago. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has really seen a conflict where 21st century weapons are being used in a 20th century kind of war. And when Europe had thought that its holiday with economic rise and no other military threat would never end, has suddenly got to go back to the drawing board. And Mr. Trump, who was the great disruptor in international relations, had warned Europe that you have to take on the responsibility of your own security, which means 2% expenditure of GDP is a must. And Europe is now looking at doing that. In fact, some are doing more. Germany is pledged that it will spend $120 billion over the next 10 years. And that means there is a big market for the defense industry. Also, it has thrown up the big question about the relevance of international bodies like the UN. It has proved to be completely ineffective in dealing with one of its major responsibilities, which is to get peace in the world. So therefore, when superpowers or P5 powers get into a conflict, you know, even the model of each other vetoing each other during the Cold War goes into the dustbin. Because here there is, I mean, you just can't get a resolution moving against them. And when the US used to use the UN to make its point in Gulf War I and II, in the first Gulf War, it took all the countries in the euphoric mood to sort out Iraq, when there is a view that US had prodded Iraq into invading Kuwait. But there is that one view about what April Glaspie said to the Iraqis. But in Gulf War II, the world wasn't willing to go along. So the US got a few of its sidekicks together and made a coalition of the willing and went in. So what do you do when the coalition of the willing also cannot pass a resolution against Russia? And that is why there is a conflict in Europe, and it is a conflict which is essentially dividing Europe into two parts. And India, as has been rightly brought out, has had to take its own position, and I'm so glad it did, because in a way it was the coming out of Indian diplomacy. We have two senior diplomats here, but I believe, this transactive diplomacy, which America tends to use from time to time, that we will give you this so you stand with us, hasn't really worked with India this time. So this has been a kind of turning point and a high point, I believe, for Indian diplomacy. There might be another view. But the Ukraine conflict is not going to end tomorrow, because there are no clear winners. Russia hasn't won, Ukraine hasn't lost. And wars end when there is one winner and one loser. So therefore, nobody is really pushing for peace beyond a point where lip service is being given there. And India is benefiting in a way, it's sad to say so, from that, because I'm not just talking about increasing our oil imports from Russia from 2 to 24%, but I'm talking about the fact that India is now being shaken into realizing that it can do its own thing without looking over its shoulder. The other aspect which everyone talks about is China and the rise of China. And in fact, though China is not a big player in the Ukraine conflict, it is going to be the biggest winner of the Ukraine conflict, because it's got Russia now very clearly leaning towards China. Whether Russia will be a junior partner or not, I'm not too sure, because the Russian ambassador has spoken about that recently, and which he has said, we don't know what it means to be a junior partner. And also, more importantly, you don't do away with a country that's been a superpower for 50, 60, 70 years. So even if Russia is, in conventional sense, its military clout is destroyed, and it has handled this conflict shabbily, I'm myself very surprised. And let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, because we have Russian equipment, it doesn't mean we'll do equally as badly in the event of a conflict, because we have something which even the Russians don't have. We have the kind of military leadership and the kind of men that no other army in the world can boast of. And with respect, sir, even the Navy. and therefore, we will be able to hold our own, come what may, and more than deliver, despite a two-front threat, which is now very clear staring at us. In fact, the Chinese intrusions of 2020 have done us a favor. We have not lost more than those brave men of 16 Bihar. We haven't lost too many, but we've learned a number of lessons. We've learned that you cannot just continue to harp on a bulletless border with China and hope like hell that your multiple rounds of talks are going to eventually lead to something. China is in no mood to give in. And there is an aspect which doesn't come out, but it is there. The strategic gains it sees from holding on to Aksai Chin. Aksai Chin has the largest collection of rivers, water lines that go into Jammu Kashmir and POK. And water, if stored to 10,000 liters of fresh water, if stored properly, and China has invested in 5 dams in POK of $26 billion worth each. Why is it putting that much money there? Of course, one reason is to take electricity northwards into Kashgar and beyond into Chinese regions. But more important is the fact that China is storing water to mix that water with the sands of Taklamakan Desert and with chemical activity create silicon wafer. And silicon wafer helps you create chips. China is under chips embargo, courtesy Donald Trump. Its import at that year, I think 2018-19, was about $270 billion. That's been stopped. So will China attack Taiwan to Taiwan's silicon wafer semiconductor resources? Or it will just take over the islands next to Taiwan where the semiconductor factories are and forget Taiwan land? China has enough land. Or will it keep ratcheting up tensions there and go towards India as a feint? Because India is the only country which has a border that is troubled with China out of the Quad nations. Please remember, I wrote a piece in 2020, was 2020 Deja Vu 1962, when China went in 1962 to teach India a lesson. Before that, there were reasons for China to believe that India needed to be managed, controlled, or tempered down. India had begun, with under Pandit Nehru, had begun to look at global leadership through NAM, and Nehru's stature was rising enormously in the world. Pandit Nehru also saw the non-alignment as his calling card, as Gandhiji's calling card was non-cooperation. So what did we get out of non-alignment? There are debates about it, but there were benefits at that point of time. Is it relevant now? Can it be revived now? I don't think so, but then there is a debate also about that. But the important thing was India was seen by China as a challenge to Mao's stature. India was also seen to be in America's camp, though India was not in America's camp. And barring aside one or two people who contest the views, I believe that India was offered a place in the UN Security Council by Eisenhower, but India did not consider it relevant at that point of time to get involved there, because India, as Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon has argued also in his very powerful book, India will come when it comes. So India was waiting for it to rise, for itself to rise with the kind of strengths that it has, as Commodore Bhaskar has also brought out, and get its whole act together. And that is the sum of Mr. Menon's book also, that eventually India's biggest challenge is the Human Development Index. India's biggest challenge is to get its national security. And national security, I've always argued, is not a case-by-case situation. It is a holistic sum of the whole, which means the China-Pakistan challenge, the engagement with America and Russia, but at the same time looking at internal security challenges. And the military, and I'm ex-army officer, I belong to a fraternity, but I don't share their views, that we will only look at external threats. If the threat to your national security is internal, you bloody well get involved. So there is no question of saying that I will wait for the whistle to be blown for me and then I'll get activated. And therefore, whether the military likes it or not, it is involved in a major challenge like Kashmir. And it has been involved in the Northeast for long, as General Nair, who's no more, had once called. The one singular factor about the Northeast insurgency is that it's consistently low-key, but it's there. It's not solved. And therefore, how much more can the military get involved between external and internal threats? Because both have an overlapping effect on either. You see, if internal security situations go out of hand, say a Balakot type strike or a Mumbai type strike, many times over, not just in Mumbai, but in other cities, are you then going to say it's an internal security matter and I will only roll my tank columns and I will only roll my Air Force out onto the tarmac when there is a full-fledged war? Or you use them to contain these strikes becoming unmanageable and the whole process of India's growth story gets disrupted? Because that is the end aim of India's adversaries. And there is the big challenge for India that, as some people would argue, that the narrative that is emerging within India in some levels, that there are various levels of Indian people and Indian society and they must be compartmentalized. Do you defend that narrative or do you contest that? Because if you defend that, then the very idea of India that the founding fathers since independence had tried to create, and we are all products of that era, gets challenged, because you then have a society, and which is what political scientists had predicted way back in the 50s, that India will continue to be victim to fissiparous tendencies, which means that India will continue to be threatened by factionalism, friction within India, and India doesn't have to bother about external threats because India will bring its own house down. Now, is that a challenge that you should address, or you should just hope for the best and ignore the worst? So these are the big challenges I feel that India needs to do, and diplomacy. The world is, as Ambassador Kajdu, I think, recently wrote in the Indian Express, the world is going to engage with India because India provides a huge market. And they would be happy to ignore some of the issues which are otherwise things that they stand up against elsewhere in the world. You can say Russia and China are autocracies, but you cannot say that about India because India is a thriving democracy. But how do you benchmark the conference of democracies, as the Americans did a year and a half ago, when you invite Pakistan into the conference of democracies, but you don't invite Bangladesh into it? You see, there are issues. Is America the benchmark on how democracies should behave? If it is America the benchmark on how you should engage with the rest of the world? And what is your core strategic area of interest? Is it only to visit Moscow and Washington? Or your core strategic area is between the coast of Africa and the South China Sea? Is that your core strategic area? Now, if that is your core strategic area, where should your investments be? There was a Marshall Plan which revived Germany after World War II. There was a MacArthur Plan that revived Japan after World War II. Is there time, Mr. Misri, for a Modi plan that can be implemented in India's neighborhood? And if it is, which are the countries we should really target? Was the $3.9 billion investment in a sinking Sri Lanka worth it when Sri Lanka's president made his first trip after that to China? How are we going to give and extract mileage? Or are we going to be only a benevolent giver? Because somebody once told me, a Deputy High Commissioner of Bangladesh, that she had done her PhD at Johns Hopkins. And her thesis was that the only model of governance that will do well in South Asia is a benevolent dictatorship. Can we have that model for South Asia's foreign policy? A benevolent India as a counter to a domineering China? That's the question I leave for you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Well, thank you, sir. And now I'd like to leave this entire session and hand it over to Mr. Mohammad Ali Shah, Major Mohammad Ali Shah. And just to sum up, as Major Maroof Raza mentioned, India is a bright spot in the global economy. It is fueled by a robust democracy, private consumption, and it is on the right track, so to say. But what is the vision for the next decade? That is going to be the topic of our discussion. Handing over to you, Major Mohammed.
Thank you, Ruchira. Thank you very much. Jai Hind, everyone. I'll start with a small poem which I was coming on the way. On the way, I got a WhatsApp forward, and the poem read something like this. I thought it was very apt for this occasion. It read something like, "The topper of the class is a happy homemaker. The backbencher of the lot turned into a very successful entrepreneur. The fiery fashionista became a dreaded lawyer, and the often ignored Joe turned into a well-known writer. And the boy who often stood outside the class became a very respected diplomat. And the boy who we didn't have any hopes from became a very well-known sportsman. And the girl who refused my proposal today would be regretting it perhaps." And the girl, again, who no one had any hopes from, today became a very respected Defense Forces officer. The reunion taught me how people come with different layers and how you should never judge a book by its cover. Because each child out there has a different success story. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here with Ambassador Menon, Komodo Bhaskar, Major Maroof Raza. And Ruchira, I am truly overwhelmed, and thank you very much, Mr. Soumitra Sen, for having sent this invitation to me and to get the opportunity to share the panel with such eminent personalities. a lot has been spoken about security, sir, by our government, by our defense forces personnel, on television, many analysts. So my first question to you, sir, how do you think India as a growing economy, a global power, is going to lead the way for the world to be a better place in terms of security, sir?
Well, the biggest contribution we can make is by handling our own affairs well. I mean, that takes care of, almost 20% of humanity. And I think if you can provide a model of stability, of growth in a difficult world like this, you've done your bit. And we have a lot of work to do at home. I think what was said by all three of us,
Right.
you can't distinguish how we run our internal affairs from what happens in the rest of the world anymore. And that distinction, so first responsibility to the world, apart from the responsibility to ourselves and our people, is to run our own affairs well and to make sure that we are a cohesive, secure, a peaceful, stable society where everybody has a real hope of leading a normal, prosperous life and realizing their potential. For me, that's the biggest contribution we can make. And this is why, Indira Gandhi used to say, India will be a different power. Because you can't say this about many countries, that if they just ran their own affairs well, they'd be making a major contribution to the world. It's true of maybe 4 or 5 countries in the world. You can say it about the US, you can say it about China. And this is what, for me, that's where India's real greatness lies. I think we underestimate ourselves. We don't think of ourselves in those terms. But it's very important that we start there. You can't do other things, lead the world, do all this. You can't do all that unless you manage yourself properly. And that, for me, is the key. And you can think of other things to do, but that's tactical stuff. But at the strategic level, I think we have to keep coming back to home. What do we do here? How do we manage ourselves?
Right, sir. Very well spoken, sir. As Gautam Buddha had once said, that you can't expect peace unless you have peace from within. The same way you have answered it very, very beautifully, sir. Sir, to Komodo Bhaskar, sir. Sir, we have moved a great deal ahead in Atmanirbhar Bharat, being self-reliant. Like, for example, the INS Vagir has just been commissioned recently. So, there was a time when we used to import equipment rather from Russia, Israel, America. We still do, but now we've also started exporting equipment to countries like Philippines and to other countries. So how far and where do you see the Atmanirbhar Bharat actually when we would be totally 100% self-reliant, sir?
Actually, I shouldn't come across like the bad fairy at the good party. But actually, our Atmanirbhar kind of aspiration is to be lauded, is to be commended. But it didn't start now. This started in the 50s. The whole attempt at trying to acquire self-sufficiency in critical areas of defense. And yes, Prime Minister Modi has given this a lot of priority. But since you mentioned the Vagir, the submarine, and I can talk about the Navy with a little more knowledge of the detail. Today, I think while the aspiration is there, India's attempt at acquiring a credible level of self-sufficiency is at a very, very early stage. I'll give you the ship as an example. We in the Navy are very proud that we've acquired a fair amount of competence in indigenization. But if you take a warship, it has 3 elements. First of all, it must float. Then it must move. And finally, it must fight. So those are the 3 levels at which you sort of design and propel the ship. So we're doing pretty well at design. It's a plus point. The Indian Navy has got a lot of depth now in water table in ship design. We are about 30-40% in propulsion. We have got some Indian entities that are providing propulsion. We've done a great job on the nuclear submarine with Russian assistance. But where it comes to ordnance and making this platform a fighting platform, we are totally dependent on imports. And this is very true for the other 2 services also, the Air Force and the Army, in different ways. So today, I think the Atmanirbhar project is to be supported, is to be commended, but there is an enormous amount of work ahead because our critical sort of inadequacy, which is what I spoke earlier, is that we have not invested adequately in R&D.
Right.
And unless a country invests not only in the fiscal part, but in the ecosystem of R&D, which means the HR, which means the institutions. Let me give you a naval example because this I think is relevant to SOBA. You guys are thought leaders, civil servants, corporates or whatever. In the Navy we had, during the Cold War, a breakthrough by a young Indian naval officer, a man called Paul Raj, commander then Paul Raj. He introduced a sonar. If you remember in the Cold War, underwater detection was a very, very specialized kind of area. The Russians, the Soviets, the Americans, nobody would part with technology. Paul Raj came up with a sonar, Indian, great potential. But the Indian ecosystem did not allow it to develop. So much so the man felt constrained. The naval chief couldn't do much because of the kind of socialization that we had in the services and the civilian sector at that time. Paul Raj left India, went to Stanford, was given all the support and made some breakthroughs. And if those of you who are in S&T know, he was awarded the Marconi Prize, which is the equivalent of the Nobel Prize in technology, S&T, in communication. So this is the example I often cite to say that we have potential, but we are not able to create that. And I hope the Modi effort will make the difference. So at the moment, it's a work in progress.
Right, sir. Thank you very much. So to Major Madhu Prasad, sir. So you have written extensively on China, on Indochina, and in fact your recent book, which is doing really well. I have read that book. I have had the honor of reading that. So tell me, the entire 3,488 kilometer stretch, the line of actual control, is only a perception. There is no line drawn over there, and obviously, I mean, the area is so difficult. You cannot actually man it. You cannot really draw a line over there. Many of my friends who are not from the armed forces background have often asked me, but why can't we just simply fence it? It's as simple as that. I said, no, it's not what you are thinking. It's not. So now we've also had 16 levels of military talks with them, co-commander level. So what do you think would ever a solution be reached with China, if at all? And if that would be reached, how could that be possible, according to you, sir?
Okay, I'm going to say a few things that the distinguished Mr. Menon may not agree with, because for no other reason, because he has a greater understanding of the subject. Mine is a layman's understanding. Let me bring out a few things. The first is General J.J. Singh, former army chief, has twice, at least on my TV shows, said that the boundary with China is actually 4,200 kilometers. The reason is there is a marked boundary also. You know, there are parts which are briefly the so-called international border near to Hiroshima area. The second thing is the boundary marked at all? Well, Pandit Nehru had said about the McMahon line, which runs from Bhutan to the India-China-Myanmar tri-junction north of Arunachal Pradesh. He had said, map or no map, this is my border. So there is a line. In fact, if you go back and you see, my book has talked about also the Shimla conference of 1913-14, where in the conference, you know, Sir Henry McMahon, who was a boundary line expert, he'd also been involved in drawing the line, which is the Durand line that separates Pakistan from Afghanistan. Tried very hard to get both boundaries sorted out, the boundary in Ladakh and the boundary, the McMahon line. Eventually, in sheer frustration, when things were not moving, because the Chinese rep who was there kept dragging his feet, in a very sort of ceremonious way, he laid out a map, pulled out a thick marker pen, and drew out the McMahon line. So the McMahon line, made by a marker pen on a quarter-inch map, also is a reason for confusion, because if you really interpret that on the ground, it could be, the boundary could be Habitat Center and Nehru Park. You see, about a kilometer and a half away, because that's how thick the marker pen runs when interpreted on a quarter-inch map to a, you know, as an army officer, how much maps and lines make a difference on the ground. When a CO once told me, don't believe the map, go on the ground to check it out. Now, what happens about the Ladakh part of it? You see, there are three lines that have done the rounds. One is the Johnson line. Johnson was an Anglo-Indian cartographer who was bribed by the then Maharaja of Kashmir to say that extend my borders as far as possible, because that will where be my kingdom be, and I'll give you a post-retirement job. So he made the Johnson line. That is the big hook that goes on the right of the map of Ladakh when you see Ladakh. Then you had the McCartney line and the McCart line. These came into being at separate times between 1892, 97 and that period, where British were more concerned about the Russian expansion into that parts of Tibet and China, because the whole Shimla conference was about defining the boundaries of Tibet. And so therefore Tibet was always central to the China problem of India. And the Chinese, some of you might not know that until 1912, you should try and capture Tibet and get thrashed by the Tibetans and go back to China via Calcutta. You know, boats were taken from Calcutta. So there are many angles. And so therefore, the boundaries of Ladakh were left ill-defined. Now, the Chinese have, at least twice in history, offered us a swap proposal, which means they keep the Aksai Chin area, and as I said, Aksai Chin provides them water resources, but it was a place where the Soviets had taken out excavated uranium to push it northwards. North of Afghanistan, there is a place called Semipalatinsk, where the Soviets did their first nuclear test. And when Mao went on his first foreign trip to Moscow, he was virtually made to crawl by Stalin, a Khrushchev in front of him, and Khrushchev then finally did the deal that you become our partner against US expansion and we'll give you nuclear know-how. That from Aksai Chin know-how was translated into area in Tibet called Lucknow, which Wing Commander Nath, who's still alive in his mid-90s, had photographed in aerial reconnaissance. Incidentally, he's double Mahavir Chandra. And his photographs were dismissed by Krishna Menon, his entire exercise, saying, okay, you've seen the Chinese in Aksai Chin. That's all we want to know, if you've seen them there or not. There's a whole argument about did India actually anticipate a Chinese attack or not. So effectively, the boundaries, there is a working dimension to the boundaries, but you cannot go in for negotiations to say, I'll have this, that and the other. Thank you very much for joining me at the conference. You get nothing. You don't get a deal with somebody like China with that. If you want the problem resolved, you have to give a bit and take a bit. And China was willing to give you, but not now, but willing to give you Arunachal Pradesh with the McMahon line, give or take a little, provided we let them be in Aksai Chin. In fact, my argument is since independence, have we ever been in Aksai Chin? We haven't. So your claims are based on history, because the Maharaja of Kashmir had 1 or 2 military posts at Haji Langar and 1 or 2 other places, but which were also abandoned because of bad weather. So China's claims on the South China Sea is also based on history. It's not based on China being there. So now it has fortified its presence by reclaiming land and making runways and making islands, etc., and saying we are there. That's what China is doing. Salami slicing is about entering and then saying that we've always been here. So when did you come in? So I think we have to get real, but getting real means making political concessions. That is not going to happen during election time. We've got an election coming up in a year or two. But that is going to happen if there is a leadership in India which is willing to concede as well as take and resolve the problem and then move ahead. But the bigger question then comes in, if you resolve the problem of the boundary with China, will China let you go? That's what I asked a Pakistani when I was in a fellowship in America. I said, अगर हम कश्मीर का मसला आपके साथ सॉल्व कर देंगे, तो आप हमारी जान छोड़ देंगे? He said, साहब ऐसे कैसे हो सकता है? So, therefore, the counter view is there merit in solving the problem? Because solving the problem is not going to stop India's rise. And as long as India rises and challenges Chinese hegemony in Asia and the world, China will always see you as a rival. I mean, read the book by Martin Jacques. It's called When China Rules the World. It's precisely this argument that China doesn't want rivals. By 2050, as I think Ambassador Menon had brought out, China has already spelled out its benchmarks. It will be the most powerful country in the world. To start with, China already has a bigger navy than America. Whether it carries the same punch or not is a different issue. But in numbers, they already have. So they are going into the numbers game. They are growing. The West has allowed it to grow on the stupid assumption that if they become rich, they'll become a happy democracy. That didn't happen. But China has become rich. It's poured the money into its own comprehensive national power. And comprehensive national power, as I'm sure the distinguished speakers would know, is your economy, is your state of growth, is your per capita income, which may be today $10,000, which may become $25,000. It has to be your deep pockets by which it is buying out nations, as America has also bought out nations. Diplomats would know half the diplomats in Washington, New York, are on American payrolls, in a sense that poor countries, smaller countries don't have money to set up embassies there. So America gives them a little building where it says, this is your embassy, hang your flag, but when we tell you, you vote for us. This is how it works. So I'm being a bit harsh, but I'm telling you in layman's words what is the reality. The solution only comes twofold. One is India becomes more powerful than China, which may happen in 100 years, not 50 years. And then it looks down at China and says, sign on the bloody dotted line and let's close the matter. Or you do a swap now and then you focus on other things. But I don't think a swap per se will lead to a solution, but that is one solution.
Very well answered by you, sir. Thank you very much. Sir, ladies and gentlemen, you all heard the macro level strategy about, safeguarding our frontiers and of our country and all. With your permissions, I would like to share a small story on the micro level, slightly on the national security. It's a true story, but it's not a story, I would say it's an incident which actually occurred with a senior of mine from the army. On 28th June, 1999, we all know what happened in 1999, right? What happened in 1999? Kargil war was on. So there was a young officer, 24 years old, by the name of Captain Kangruze. Major Maruf Raza mentioned about an officer with 2 Mahavir Chakras. Captain Kangruze was awarded the Mahavir Chakra for gallantry posthumous thereafter. So Captain Kangruze was deployed at the line of control 18,000 feet above mean sea level in a temperature of minus 10 degrees centigrade. They had just returned from a long-range patrol, and where Captain Kangruze got orders that they were the post of the enemy overlooking a cliff and was overlooking a highway which was causing huge destruction and havoc for our armed forces. So Captain Kangruze was assigned the task to go and destroy that post. Now post midnight, what happens at night? Obviously sound travels faster, right? A small pin will multiply into 100, the sound of a pin. So Captain Kangruze and his platoon of 10 brave men started climbing towards that peak. The enemy got wind of the fact that our brave soldiers, the Indian army, is climbing from one particular direction because of the sound coming in. So the enemy got alert. They looked from the night vision binoculars and they saw the movement of 10 brave hearts advancing towards them. Now enemy obviously got alert and they cocked their weapons and they sat waiting for our soldiers to close in. Now in the army there is something known as a killing range of a weapon and an effective range of a weapon. Now, a killing range of a weapon is, supposing, for example, if I'll give you, if my rifle has a capacity of firing 750 meters in range, does that mean when I see the enemy at, say, 750 meters, I'll open fire? Yes? No. I'll wait for the enemy to close in, right? Say about 100 meters. Then I can have the maximum damage and maximum casualty upon the enemy. So the enemy waited for our brave hearts to come in about 100 meters from them. And the enemy opened fire indiscriminately in all directions from where our soldiers were climbing up. They were firing all over the place. There was not a single place which was left out, which was not showered by bullets. But yet, Captain Kangruze was totally unmindful of his own personal safety, who went beyond the call of duty and kept motivating his men to climb up despite the bullets raining on them. And none of them was shot until then. Just then, Captain Kangruze got wounded in his abdomen. A grenade splinter came and pierced him in his abdomen, and 3 bullets were fired upon his abdomen. He took out his military belt, tightened it faster so that, now the blood which was oozing out would be controlled to some extent at least. And he turned around, he told his men, I've been shot, but don't worry about me, keep climbing. He kept motivating his men. And Captain Kangruze's boots were slipping from the cliff. He took out his boots in that minus 10 degrees centigrade with heavy snowfall, and threw his boots off. As he climbed up, he was the first soldier from the entire platoon to climb up. He came face to face with the enemy soldiers. And he was carrying a rocket launcher around his neck, which is very, very heavy, and a commando knife. His personal arm was being carried by his buddy. And the moment he saw the 3 soldiers, he took out his commando knife, he neutralized the enemy single-handedly, and he told his men, the moment he saw the enemy, "Aaj mauka hai. Ek bhi dushman bach ke nahi jana chahiye. Fire karo!" The whole thing was a battlefield. There was firing happening from both the ends. And just then, Captain Kangaroo was shot in the abdomen, crawled towards the enemy bunker, took out a rocket launcher, and he neutralized the bunker. Both the bunkers, both the bunkers were destroyed. Thereafter, the enemy which was running from there was running because they were firing from behind, right? The enemy. If they turn around and they fire like this, the agility would be lost. So the enemy was firing from behind and they were running. And just then a burst of enemy fire came and hit Captain Kangaroo on his chest, who fell from the cliff. And when he fell from the cliff, our brave hearts went down to search for Captain Kangaroo. They could not find him anywhere. Then once again they searched and they found Captain Kangaroo lying there in a pool of blood, with his spinal cord broken, his legs twisted, his arms twisted, but yet 3 bullets in his abdomen, a burst fire on his chest. He had not died. Captain Kangaroo had not died. Why? Because he had become a martyr, and martyrs never die. They become legends and stay in our hearts and minds forever. The men were carrying the national flag in their rucksack. That's a skeli, that's a pittu jhola. Commonly we use that term in the army language. They took out the national flag from their pittu jhola. They raped the body of their 24-year-old brave platoon commander, Captain Kangaroo, in the national flag. They started the climb once again, this time with uncertainty because they did not know whether the enemy would have come back there with a reinforcement. They climbed up, they planted the national flag there, put the body of the brave platoon commander next to the national flag, saluted it, and our brave hearts, our brave men cried, they wept like little babies in arms. And they said together in unison, "Ye jeet aapki hai, Nimbo Saab." They would call him Nimbo Saab affectionately because Captain Kangaroo is a very long name, right? "Ye jeet aapki hai, Nimbo Saab, ye hill aapka hai. Aaj se ye hill, Nemo Hill kehlayega." If ever any of you go to Kargil to see where the Indian Army fought for your tomorrow, you will find a very prominent feature over there known as Nemo Hill. Now that is the story of Nemo Hill, but the story doesn't end over here. When Captain Kangaroo's body was being brought back from Kargil to Dimapur and thereafter to Kohima, where the airport is in Dimapur, right? So that time, 3 decades, 30 years of insurgency in Nagaland. Nagaland's got a very subdivided society. There are different tribes. There is Ao, Angami, Chang, Chakazang, Semma, Lotha, Mao. There are different tribes. And they didn't have much unity. The entire Nagaland united, they joined hands. That time there was no COVID, so after washing their hands, of course. And they greeted Captain Kangaroo's body on top. They honored it by saying, "Captain Kangaroo, Amar Rahe, Amar Rahe." And where he was buried in Kohima is a World War cemetery very close by, where it's written on a tombstone, "How can a man die better than facing fearful odds? For the ashes of his fathers in the temple of his gods." On the tombstone written over there, "When you go home, tell them of us, and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today." Thank you. Now,
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Major.
I thought this was since Ambassador Menon had spoken about leadership, I thought this was a very good story on leadership as well, where your platoon commander, your leader is not there with you anymore, but your team is giving credit to the leader, "Ye jeet aapki hai, Nimbo Saab." Because as you all know, when a boss says "I," a leader says "we." A boss says "get there on time," a leader says "let's get there ahead of time together." A boss knows how it is done, a leader shows how it is to be done. A boss takes the credit, a leader gives it away. So, of course, Captain Kangaroo was a very good leader. And, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Very inspirational anecdote. But we'll just have a quick round of questions and then we'll open up it to the audience. So I'd like to start with you, Ambassador Menon. Self-sufficiency in defense, as we all agreed, is critical for India to reach where we wanted to reach. So I know India is a land of opportunity, it's the land of also complex challenges. So in your mind, which is the biggest challenge that India faces currently in reaching where it has to as a global superpower, and how can we really overcome it?
You know, for me, in my experience, the biggest shortage we have, and it sounds paradoxical, is actually people. I mean, we have 1.3 billion people, but when you actually try and fill a job, it's very hard to find the right person for that job. Because all these problems we have, whether, as Uday was saying, we do have the talent, we have the people who can do wonders, but we need to give them the opportunity. And that, frankly, I don't see either the national security system or the education system in general producing the kinds of people that we actually need. We churn out degrees, but that's not the same at all as, and look how long we've taken to do, say, the National Defense University. You know, we need to create a whole infrastructure of how we think, act, learn, and deal with these issues. Because it shouldn't be that there are 3 or 4 experts who speak on this all the time, whether it's on television or in forums like this.
Yes.
For me, that's the biggest thing that's missing.
A larger voice.
Is
and
people,
interaction,
is,
yes.
is having people who are actually engaged in this. I don't know if it's your experience in your jobs or not, but you know, in various jobs I find, I mean, even just a simple business of propaganda, All India Radio, doing external services in Dari, in Pashto, in Gorkhali, you can't find people in Tibetan, in Chinese.
All right.
I mean, and 1.3 billion people we are. I mean, that's the minimum. If you want to have some influence,
You need to have a larger voice.
you need to have a voice, and you need to actually get out there and create that. I mean, and frankly, many of these technical and other problems, when we are forced to it, you look at the space program, look at the atomic energy program. When you have no choice, you do it. And you do it well, and you find ways of doing it, which then the rest of the world wants to imitate.
Definitely.
So I'm less worried about, you know, oh, can we design engines for our boats? Can we produce the kind of weaponry? But I do think that we need to concentrate on the people, and then we'll solve these other problems.
All right. Commodore Bhaskar, what's your input here? How do you think we can overcome the internal challenges that India faces, whether it's unemployment, literacy, poverty, and of course, many more? What are your insights?
Again, just to pick up what Ambassador Menon had said earlier, my personal sort of approach or advocacy is that, number one, India should internally, domestically become not only a responsible power, but it should also be an equitable power. I think in the last few decades, perhaps we've lost sight of that. In the course of my remarks, I spoke about the human security component and the yoga kshema. I think if we focus on that, and that harmonizes with what Shankar, with what Ambassador Menon has just said, that our greatest asset is HR, human resource. And I think our greatest failure has been our inability to harness and maximize our HR. And I'll give you an illustration because my own focus is on the military technology kind of issues. Today, if you look at where military technology is going, particularly in areas like cyber, space, AI, almost 70 to 80% of the HR at the top end is being provided by professionals of Indian origin. But regrettably, they are working for non-Indian entities,
Sure.
including those who are working in places like Bangalore, like in Hyderabad, etc. And that, to my mind, is actually reflecting an inadequacy of India's top leadership. And an illustration of that, I know of the constraints of time, is that when you look at the current technology kind of leher, the kind of orientation, India has potential, but the ecosystem and the infrastructure that Mr. Menon spoke about is all being provided by non-Indian entities. And you can't sustain this if you are in a situation where, the last count, 12 of India's leading IITs, 7 of the directors' posts were empty. And when I tried to find out why from professionals in education, the answer given to me was that they had not passed the loyalty test. It was not competence that is being assessed, it was loyalty to the current ideology, etc. So I'm saying this as starkly as I can. You can't expect competence and the kind of high levels of accomplishment if your benchmarking is not appropriate. I think that is our biggest inadequacy.
Sure. Thank you for sharing that. Major Maruf Raza, what are your insights here? Quickly, if you could sum up, what is your view?
Well, I'd like to echo the sentiment which has been expressed by Ambassador Menon and Dr. Bhaskar. You see, basically, we have not exploited our demographic dividend. I remember Prime Minister Modi saying so at the Madison Square Gardens in New York, when he made this big arrival on the global stage in his visit 2013. I happened to be there to cover that event for television. And, he talked about India's demographic dividend. There are certain things about India we must get real about. One is that, we are too mesmerized by our democratic credentials. We say we are the world's largest democracy, so all our sins be forgiven. You may be the world's largest democracy, but again, there is a problem with it that dissent is not equal to democracy. You cannot oppose everything the ruling party does in the name of democracy. The ruling party cannot do everything because it has number of parliamentarians under its wrap to show that we have the people's support. The people often vote for a leader at the top, and that is the problem with India's democracy. That, therefore, I believe Mrs. Gandhi had tried to move that thing about making India into a presidential form of government. I'm saying some of the unspeakable things, but the fact is that she had suggested that because at the end of the day, if you vote in the next election, you will vote for either Mr. Modi or somebody else who's opposing him. You're not going to vote for your parliamentarian who may be a good guy or a bad guy. He just happens to get a ticket from Mr. Modi's party. So you're voting for Modi and hoping like hell this guy will get something delivered to your constituency. The second problem is 3/4 of India's graduates are unemployable. You're producing graduates. Like in everything else, we produce volumes. You blow a whistle, you'll have 100 guys line up here outside Habitat Center to listen to what you have to say. Getting people there is not a problem. That's why when Trump came to India, he was given this big audience in Ahmedabad Stadium, and he loved it. Because in America, president's speeches are not attended by more than 5,000 to 6,000 people. Here he got maybe 100,000, whatever.
Sure.
Now the fact is that you have numbers, but how are you going to translate those numbers into India's strength? I'll give you an example. We could have been in the 1990s the country that everybody could go to because of our ability to use English language to do things. But Philippines has overtaken us. And now we have people in the educational system who are saying that, knowing English and being anglicized is a crime. Because, वो भाषा हमारे लिए नहीं चलेगी. Fine. Then you go and reinvent the wheel. That means you're going to lose that much of time. There is no time in today's day and age. As somebody once said, there was an agricultural revolution for 3,000 years. There was an industrial revolution for 300 years. There is an IT revolution which has happened in 30 years. The next revolution is probably going to happen in 10 years. Are you up to speed with that? You need the country to adopt those benchmarks and not tell somebody that graduation कर लो नौकरी नहीं मिलती, post graduation कर लो वो भी नहीं मिलती, JNU में PhD कर लो, with due respect sir. The fact of the matter is, yaar, get on with it and address the problem. Get on with it and have your coffee and look at yourself in the mirror and ask yourself some serious questions. What are you all about? What can you deliver? Is that old saying, ask not what the country can do for you, ask what you can do for the country. Now that should be the motto every school should adopt. And Scindia School, I'm sure, must be doing that. A lot of other good schools do it. But this is what you have to tell the youth. Don't expect, just because we pay tax, everything should be done by the government. I mean, then you're becoming like a Pakistani, because he doesn't pay tax and he still expects the government to do it.
All right, so one last question to all of you. India, of course, provided vaccines to more than 70 countries. It conducted almost 38 missile tests in the year 2022, and it has beaten recession trends as opposed to most other emerging economies. So according to you, what does the road ahead look like, and what should be the vision for the next decade? We can start with you. Just one last closing comments.
My vision is, to me, quite clear. We have to focus on equitable development of the most vulnerable cross sections of India. And when in doubt, look at the Constitution. I think we have, on occasion, perhaps not been as focused on one, what we gave to ourselves in 1950. And the second, of course, is I think our current focus on development has not been equitable as it ought to be. There is a kind of disaggregation which has a reflection of Indian politics, where the majoritarian kind of sentiment and the way that is manifest is likely to lead, to my mind, my focus, like the blind man and the elephant, is internal security. I fear that if this is not addressed in the appropriate manner, we will have the kind of situations that we have seen over the last year, including state police finding themselves at odds to each other, and where in many ways, the kind of mob mentality that we see is overtaking. Let me close on this. I'm a history buff. I love history. And if you remember Pliny of old, he had said in one of his chapters that when he talks about the amphitheater, that there was a time when Rome became the mob. And alas, the mob became Rome. And that is the beginning of the downfall. I'm not suggesting that it is so dire, but I think this is an area that needs to be addressed by the citizen, which is what SOBA is all about.
All right, Ambassador Menon, your closing comments.
In the next 10 years, we still have a lot to do to accumulate the material power that India needs in order to be true to its own promise to its citizens, to give our citizens the life they deserve. So I think we're still at that stage. Worrying about, playing a big role, getting other people to recognize us, seat in the Security Council, big leaders in the world, frankly, not now. We have more important things to do. The world is a mess. Let the world be a mess. We have promise. We have opportunities. Take them. And that's the thing to do. But much more clarity of purpose. I mean, that's where we need to start getting rid of the dross that we've accumulated. And the way we talk about being a great power and so on, forget about that. Let's give our citizens what we've promised them in our Constitution. That's what we should concentrate on.
Great, very well pointed out. Major Maroof Raza, your closing comments, the vision for the country.
3 quick points. Point 1, as Ambassador Menon has rightly brought out, even Commodore Bhaskar, we need to channelize our national energies through our people in the correct way, and I think that is a set of do's and don'ts the government of the day has to spell out for institutions that is training people. That what is the expectation? Expectation is not to have endless number of PhDs who become unemployed. Expectation is to have people who can go out and deliver with skill sets, because skills is something that you can have and cannot have without going to the classroom. Okay, so there are a lot of skills and those need to be developed. The second thing is internal security is of paramount importance. I learned this in great detail when I wrote my dissertation at Cambridge, because my tutor said to me, write something which will help you the rest of your life. And I wrote that, and I can still go back to that study again and again, and it gave me a lot of information to go on. The stability of India is linked to its internal security. And we cannot. The other day, I just did a discussion with Rahul Shivshankar on, is Punjab going back to the Punjab of the 80s? There are two elements. One is the ideology and those who support it internally and externally. And when you flounder, how your neighbors, as a consequence, take benefit of that.
Sure.
And third and most important thing for India is to take its own position on world affairs. It need not be in anybody's camp. I recently wrote a piece I was quite happy to see 1 month down the line, it's still on the Times Now website. It says, should India be in any big power camp or should India be a swing state? I believe we should be a swing state. Bharat Karnad first wrote about it. Mr. Jaishankar talks about it. But I also believe we have the capacity to take an event by event, country by country decision. And I think you do that, and the diplomats here will probably be able to elaborate more. But it's something people will respect you for, and not for being a camp follower.
All right. Major Shah, would you like to add anything to this before we close the discussion?
Yeah, we can close it. I mean, thank you very much. मैं वैसे एक उर्दू में एक कविता सुनाऊंगा मैं अगर इजाजत हो तो ये
टाइम कम है
तो
जल्दी से सुना दीजिए
थोड़ी सुनाता हूँ मैं उर्दू में ये फैज अहमद फैज साहब की है ये क्योंकि आप कविता सुना रहे थे ना उन्होंने लिखा था मैंने समझा था कि तू है तो दरख्शां है हयात तेरा हम है तो हम दहर का झगड़ा क्या है तेरी सूरत से है आलम में बहारों को सबात तेरी आंखों के सिवा दुनिया में रखा क्या है तू जो मिल जाए तो तकदीर निगू हो जाए यूं ना था मैंने फकत चाहा था यूं हो जाए और भी दुख हैं जमाने में मोहब्बत के सिवा राहतें और भी हैं वसल की राहत के सिवा अनगिनत सदियों की तारीख बहीमाना तलिस्म रेशमो अतलसों कम ख्वाब में बुनाए हुए जा बजा बिकते हुए कूचो बाजार में जिस्म खाक में लिथड़े हुए खून में निलाए हुए जिस निकलते हुए अमराज की तरुणों से पीप बहती हुई कलते हुए नसरों से लौट जाती है उधर को भी नजर क्या कीजिए और भी दुख है जमाने में मोहब्बत के सिवा राहतें और भी हैं वसल की राहत के सिवा मुझसे पहली सी मोहब्बत मेरे महबूब नामा शुक्रिया
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much for this very insightful discussion. And just to sum up, India needs to definitely leverage its biggest strength, that is its people, the large demographic dividend that we have, and also find a better voice for them. So thank you all, and thank you all for taking our time from your hectic schedules. And you must become a full-time TV anchor. You have a great, great voice and a lovely memory. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Let me call the Escavians and Scindians' wife to give away the token of appreciation. Can I call Anjana Di, Seema Di from SKV?